Now, it's time for everybody's favorite homicidal and morally bankrupt mob crew. So, let's begin.
We pay the average police officer $30,000 a year in salary and benefits to protect us. But of 25,000 police in this city, only 1,500 patrol the streets on an average shift. More cops than that call in sick every day. Obviously, we need more police on the streets. And we can do it without spending more money, by better use of the police force we already have.
It's 1977 now, and the city's still bankrupt. The mayor is as unpopular as ever and is facing a losing battle against incoming challenger Ed Koch for the election. Violence has gone up, gang graffiti and stripped, rotten cars decorate New York City like Christmas ornaments. Vandalism is becoming so ubiquitous, it's symbolic of how out of control crime is.
So it's nighttime in Times Square. You might feel a breeze sweeping over you, cigarette butts littering the street. You can smell the cigarettes on occasion, more so than you can these days, since people smoked much more back then. And of course, there's also the scent, the nauseous scent of urine, human urine, which never seems to go away on the sidewalk in New York from the local homeless population. People briskly stride by you, not really seeing you. You're invisible. This is New York. It's the most crowded place in the entire world in Times Square, yet nobody really sees you. New York is as much a place to be forgotten about as it is to be noticed. But if you want attention, well, the answer to that is always the same. You can get plenty of that. All you have to do is lighten your wallet a little bit. That'll buy you company in New York, sex, the illusion of love, or at least a robbery.
So at this period in history, Times Square is a cesspool of sleaze and degeneracy. Prostitutes are everywhere. Drugs are everywhere. Peep shows are everywhere. Live sex shows are everywhere. For a family of tourists, well, it's a horror show. But for a mobster looking to make money, it's like Disneyland. But all the stripped cars, the gangs prowling the streets, the prostitutes and menacing pimps, and other evidence of New York City's decay would gain national attention. The media would take photographs, and it would give New York City a reputation as a place to avoid. And these images, they'd become the basis of broken windows theory, which they hit you over the head with when you're going for your master's in criminal justice. It was a policing initiative that would later be used under Bratton and Giuliani to fight crime and clean up the city. Broken windows theory is based on the idea that obvious signs of crime like vandalism, prostitution, graffiti, drug use invite larger acts of crime by sending the message that you can do whatever you want here. Organized crime still made regular headlines, but they didn't stir much public fear, especially then. The media's moral panic darling during 1976 to 77 was a serial killer named David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam. He was a guy who claimed a dog told him to kill people. He'd keep making up claims of what was the reason and who was responsible, anybody but him, for why he killed other people. Kept walking up to random attractive young white girls at night and firing a .44 Bulldog revolver at them. If they were on a date, he'd shoot the guy too. Now the sketches kept getting his image wrong, and at best did nothing to help identify him. It was a misdirection to the cops, and in reality, David was simply this plain-looking, chubby, and socially awkward mail sorter who was homicidal because he couldn't get a pretty girlfriend, if any girlfriend at all. And rather than diet, exercise, or learn to be more confident, he decided the best remedy to his problem was to get a revolver and shoot white girls in the head. And if they were beautiful, they were all the more offensive to him. Then he'd hasten away. Now, he wasn't the most methodical serial killer, not the most clever, but it was effective, and it had people terrified all over New York City, particularly white girls. Young white women were cutting their hair to look like boys. That's how terrified they were. David Berkowitz probably infuriated the mob with one of his early hits, because Detective Joe Coffey conjectured that it was a mob hit, this innocent person, because they were shot in the head. I don't know why Joe Coffey would conjecture that. Yeah, they do coup de grace, but shooting somebody in the head is obviously the most likely place that's going to kill them. So that doesn't seem very specific to the mob. And so the mob, who were trying to keep a low profile, were no fan of David Berkowitz after that incident. Especially since Joe Coffey was popular with the public and always in the media. Like a movie star detective, and would even play an active role in bringing down the Westies, the DeMeo crew, and John Gotti, making the mob reconsider their ban on killing cops. Tried to frame him at one point, but they didn't persuade very many people there. According to Sammy, the mob was planning to kill David Berkowitz if the cops didn't get him first. The other major events that year happening was on July 13th and 14th, lightning struck and interfered with circuit breakers, and the electricity died in New York City, at least most of it. And New Yorkers were then reminded of just how thuggish and barbarian many of them are when a lot of people took advantage of the situation and began looting and setting fire to buildings. These looters energetically worked the entire night to further ruin an already decaying city. 2 entire blocks in Brooklyn were burned up. There were a total of 1,037 fires set, 550 police officers injured in the rioting, and 4,500 looters were arrested, and somehow only one person in the entire 24-hour period was murdered. The late 1970s and 80s in New York City, it was one long Christmas for degenerates and outright sociopaths. It was among this background that Ruby Stein's rotting and bloated torso was discovered in Jamaica Bay off Far Rockaway Beach in May, weeks after his wife had last seen him. He was among 2 torsos found that weekend. I'm not sure if they even ever identified the other one. They might have, I don't know. Stein's murder was determined to have some connection with the Westies, And the Mafia weren't happy about the Westies hurting Stein for a couple reasons. Genovese's, they were particularly unhappy because he was a Genovese Cosa Nostra associate, and he was obviously a very lucrative source of earning. And I think Genovese mob boss Tony Fats Salerno probably genuinely liked him and cared about him somewhat. So there was that too, because they had kind of a friendship going on. And then for the Gambinos and others, it was bad press for them to get more attention right now, and the Westies were associated with semi-organized Irish crime. The Westies, however, were only going to become more violent. And since Paul Castellano didn't want anything that his family was associating with acting that way, he was going to eventually seek out a meeting with Jimmy Coonan. He'd invite him, which meant, you better come or we're going to declare war on you. But it would take about a year before that meeting occurred. That wouldn't happen until 1978. In the meantime, another cop superstar was focused on organized crime, Kenny McCabe. Too often society focuses on the villainous sociopaths, psychopaths, and they are obviously, as I make this podcast, very interesting. But not enough attention gets paid to the heroes. Now, funny enough, Kenny McCabe's name even sounds like an action movie star. His dad was also a highly decorated cop, but Kenny didn't want to just follow in his coattails. He wanted to earn on his own a reputation. Kenny was very talented as an officer in his own right. He was fastidious with details. He didn't seek the public spotlight like Coffey did. That's not to down Coffey. There was a place for the media-type police officer for Coffey, and then there was a place for the kind of secretive Kenny. He was more modest. He had your thick Brooklyn accent, and he was tall and athletic, playing basketball in college, and he towered around 6'6", and he had a normally gentle demeanor, though he would talk back when the DeMeo crew talked smack to him. He had an excellent memory and was very intelligent. The kind of cop that was the antithesis of everything that Roy stood for. In a city that was at its height of corruption and violence between the 70s and 80s. It would continue to get corrupt and violence in the 80s, but through this period, McCabe was the kind of guy that the police force needed. He was like a cross between King Arthur and a bloodhound. He'd never be bought no matter how much you threw at him, and he would never be dissuaded. He was really what New York City needed then, in this society where there's so much corruption. Now, Kenny had a special loathing for Cosa Nostra. He kind of liked the gentlemanly Gambino, Carlo Gambino, because it was kind of hard not to like Carlo Gambino unless he was trying to hurt you. He was so friendly and polite and gregarious, and he was a real extrovert, unlike Paul. Kenny really hated the street thug type mobster like Gotti and DeMeo. The noxious, violent, crude, he detested them. And he considered mobsters largely indolent parasites who rather exploit people than simply work hard like everybody else. And it wouldn't be long before Kenny McCabe was on the trail of Nino Gadji and Roy DeMeo. Now, among Paul Castellano's first orders that year was to tell his new capo, Nino Gadji, to find and buy a building which could be used as a conference headquarters for his Brooklyn faction. Nino did not like this. He was very unhappy with this, and he had a good reason to be. He griped that it was going to lead to them all getting photographed and pinched. Nevertheless, Paul commanded it, and hence Nino, the loyal Castellano soldier, did what he was told. He had to anyway. Nino shopped around until he found a cheap building. He didn't want to spend too much on what he considered to be a stupid, outdated project. Now, formerly this building was a Genovese tile company, though of course that's not speaking of the Genovese family. Nino didn't even bother to take the sign down, and there that sign stayed for years. Well, it was their social club. The actual new name of the mob club was called Veterans and Friends, and their sign was scribbled into the glass. Veterans and Friends was the Brooklyn faction's new headquarters. Its storefront was on a thoroughfare. The idea of a mob social club headquarters was nothing new. Della Croce had his Ravenite Club, which had been purchased in the 50s by Carlo Gambino and named after his favorite poem by Edgar Allan Poe. Before that, it had been called the Alto Knights, which had been a hangout for Lucky Luciano rather than just purely a mob club. Then there was Gotti's crew, which hung out in Queens, and they had their Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. The Veterans and Friends was just supposed to be the Brooklyn faction's version of the Raven Knight and the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. This new conference club was put in Montiglio's name because he was the only vet they had that didn't have a criminal record. And they were going to serve drinks and food, and you couldn't have a criminal record to do that and own an establishment. Meetings, plannings, businesses took place there. Like the other mafia social clubs, it was a dull and unimaginative-looking place with minimal decorations. Usually there was an American flag in these places displayed somewhere, maybe a few trophies. They built a bar, cleaned the kitchen and back, installed a coffee, espresso, and cappuccino machine. There were tables for eating snacks, these basic wooden tables, for eating lunches, or for playing cards and reading the newspaper. Dominic hung a few old movie posters up, W.C. Fields, Jean Harlow, and Nino's personal favorite, George Raft. There was probably an old box TV up there somewhere. And in 1986, when Frankie DeChico was blown up into smoking chunks right in front of the club, W.C. Fields' poster would still be posted inside, probably the same one. But by then, there'd also be a Three Stooges poster. Like I said, these guys weren't going to win any awards for decoration. You can see the inside of the Ravenite here in one of these photos. Personally, I'd rather go to Studio 54. Seems like it's a lot more fun. I know when Paul went to Studio 54, Montiglio managed to persuade him ahead of the line. He got horrified when he saw the beautiful women and all the dancing and what he considered lascivious behavior, and he quickly retreated out. You know, murdering people, that's okay. That's not unethical if it's for greed. Cheating with your maid on your wife in the next room, well, that's understandable if you're lonely. Taking money from stolen car rings and other illicit activities, it's for business or greed. But lascivious, beautiful women, oh my God, that's immoral. So back to the Veterans and Friends. Nino was ordered to bring his crew in on Mondays for a shape-up meeting. And of course he obediently complied. Now, Roy hated going to these meetings. He was stuck with these other members of other crews and loan sharks who did nothing but gripe about how they weren't getting their money from their deadbeat customers. Roy didn't have that problem. He'd always find a way to make them pay their money back. Now, he wouldn't necessarily hurt you. Again, I'd said this in an earlier episode. If he liked you or thought you might be useful, he'd have you work for him to pay it back. But if you didn't compensate him, well, he's not going to tolerate that. Roy, as you might recall from episode 1, had been in the loan sharking business since he was a teenager, working at the Banner Dairy. He owned a small leather book, which he called the Shylock Book, after the Shakespearean villain from Merchant in Venice who would loan people money and then ask for a pound of flesh. Again, though, if he liked you, or he found you useful, he was not the worst guy to be in debt with when it came to the mafia, despite his violent reputation, and his reputation for killing you just as soon as looking at you. I'd rather be in debt to Roy if he liked me over somebody like Scarpa or Jimmy Coonan any day. With those two, you might as well just get ready for war. Or if you're weak and unable to defend yourself, just get ready to be whacked. Now, if you didn't owe him too much money, here's an example of how Roy would have you pay him back if he liked you. Albert DeMeo, Roy's son of course, recalled an incident when he was a little kid. Roy introduced Albert at the time, who was probably 5'6", to a man he called Uncle Vinny. Now, on the way to the airport, Roy explained, "Uncle Vinny isn't a blood relative, Allie, just a friend of mine." Albert didn't care. He was mostly interested in seeing the planes take off and return once he got to the airport. Roy and little Albert arrived at the airport in Roy's fancy 1970s Cadillac. He had new cars every 6 months. And there, this Uncle Vinny was waiting for them, wearing a blue uniform, and he presumably worked there. Vinny was also wearing a sycophantic, cheerful smile pasted to his face, eager to please Roy, and of course, please his son, since that also meant pleasing Roy. "How you doing, Albert?" Vinny said cheerfully, lowering himself to shake Albert's little hand like a good Roy bot. Get it? Roy bot instead of robot? Yeah, it's cringy. But, in the words of Nino, I make no apologies about it. Anyway, the oblivious Albert innocently just thought Vinny was being friendly, and Vinny and Roy went off to the cargo section and began talking. They moved out of the distance from which Albert could hear their conversation, so it was private. Then, in true old-school Italian fashion, Vinny began gesticulating energetically, as though he was speaking in some kind of odd sign language to Roy. And Roy just kind of listened quietly. At the end of their conversation, Vinny gave Roy an envelope full of money, and that was the end of it for that week. As many of you can probably figure out if you have any street smarts, they were conversing because Vinny owed Roy money. A lot of money. And he'd come up short. But, eager to pay Roy back as soon as possible, the following week, Vinny trundled in a station wagon up to Roy's first home, not the one you always see in film, and in the back of his station wagon, it was teeming with crates of fruit, both typical fruit like oranges and bananas, and more exotic ones, like what you might find from stolen cargo from an airport. This became routine every Sunday, and began to include high-quality imported chocolate, as well as a lot of coats, so many coats that the family couldn't take all of them, and Roy's wife, who was friendly and generous, gave some of them away to their neighbors. Albert asked Vinny, "Where'd you get all this stuff?" Vinny replied, "They're FOT, Albert. You know, FOT, falling off trucks." Albert just seemed kind of quizzical and confused, at which point Dad, Roy, later explained, "Son, can you keep a secret? Man to man. Your Uncle Vinny, he steals things. He's a nice guy, but he steals just about anything he can lay his hands on." Funny enough, I guess Vinny and Roy had that in common. Roy then continued, "And he bets on horses a lot, so I loaned him some money. And he can't pay it back because he keeps betting. This is his way of repaying. I don't ask him where the stuff comes from. I don't want to know." "Yeah, right, Roy. You have the heart of an angel." And innocently didn't know where a large chain of hijacked goods came from, especially since you were involved in a lot of hijacking yourself, including for guns, as I mentioned in an earlier episode. Albert, in Sins of My Father, often still continued to take his dad's reasons at face value, and accept the rationalizations that Roy gave for the bad things he did. But as you can see here, in this example, Roy had no problem from an early period lying to his kid Albert, especially if it made him sound more sympathetic. His son's respect and approval, his whole family for that matter, was very important to him after all. Besides Freddie and Chris, and maybe a few of his childhood friends, they were some of the few people he trusted enough to love. And to his credit, Roy did raise what seemed to be some highly responsible, educated, and very moral kids. And not just Albert, who seems sympathetic and like a very ethical man, but his daughters as well. One of them, I believe, is Ivy League educated, and from the little information I could get, or that I was willing to look for, they seem like very nice people. I didn't want to in any way invade the privacy. That's something I will always respect. When you compare them to Gotti's grandkids, who seemed like they were completely narcissistic, vacuous, empty-headed. I couldn't even watch that show. They were so dull and unlikable, as well as his daughter, for that matter. Well, it's like night and day. Albert and his daughters were his greatest accomplishment, though his wife, who seemed good-natured, obviously played a huge role there, too. There were moments when Roy's murderous facade sneaked out from underneath his gentle, fatherly demeanor. Now, he never hit Albert or any of his kids, wouldn't raise his voice to them. He wasn't even remotely threatening to them, and that suggests that he wasn't this pure psychopath by any means. His Freddy Krueger would come out at work, but not all the time. However, besides teaching his kid how to properly murder, he once brought him to the Ravenite Club when he was really young. You know, that mafia social club I mentioned earlier that Della Croce now owned. And in front of an audience, Roy asked Albert, "What would you do, Allie, if a bully picked on you?" "I'd shoot him in the head, cut his fucking head off." Everybody started laughing, including Della Croce, could be very violent and sadistic himself. "That's my boy," Roy said proudly. However, the things Roy would say, and probably that among them, started to disturb some of the mobsters. This guy seemed sick even for one of them. Now I'm going to keep coming back to Albert DeMeo and his childhood. It's not going to be in the same time span until I catch up as the rest of the story, 1977. And the reason why I took so long to get to Albert is because I wanted to juxtapose Roy's good side as presented in Sons of My Father with the more horrible things that Roy started doing once he had real power after he got made and became very arrogant. Not that he wasn't arrogant before, but even more arrogant. And the reason why is because I don't want to simply give you my opinion as I'm telling the story. I want you to also come to your own conclusions, and I want to give you enough information to come to your own conclusions about what you think about this guy and his psychology or the events surrounding him. And was Dominic's impression more accurate, or was Albert's? Roy must have felt elated in 1977. He not only got his dream of being a made man, he led 20 men who, by the 80s, would have proven themselves all capable, which is mob lingo for a mobster who isn't too uneasy murdering people. DeMeo was making millions of dollars now, and he was still making the rest of his crew rich too, although they were always owing him money because they didn't make as much as they spent, and that's even though they made more money than 99% of society. But the DeMeo crew were still rising in earnings and power. And his crew, while many of them might not have loved him, they liked him a lot because of all the stuff he was giving them and all the opportunity. And they both feared and respected him. And that's what Roy wanted. As Niccolò Machiavelli, Roy's favorite author, said, probably his most famous statement, "It's better to be feared than loved." Niccolò Machiavelli is probably the most misunderstood philosopher in the West, second maybe only to Nietzsche. He isn't saying to only be feared, to only try to be feared, and he wasn't advocating tyranny. That's all advice for unstable governments, where a warlord is needed, appealing to a dictatorship as the way the dictators were defined by ancient Rome, not today, where they were there to establish a republic. Machiavelli was actually pro-republic, not pro-dictator. So he isn't saying to only be feared. He says if you have to choose between love and fear, when you're in a position of power with a lot of backstabbers around you, you want to be feared, but not so feared as to be hated. Gotti was always quoting Machiavelli, but then he acted like a raging, petty, spoiled prima donna despot, and he was hardly a Machiavellian in that sense, because some of them really started to hate him. I don't know how that one survived, but I don't think he would have if he hadn't gone to prison. His behavior towards the government was hardly Machiavellian. All it did was encourage so much hatred that they would finally get him. DeMeo was a better example than Gotti of a Machiavellian. Obviously, Machiavelli wouldn't advocate being a serial killer. However, Roy, as crew chief, had the right balance with leading his men. They feared him, but they liked him too and didn't hate him. But even better, it's good to be liked and appreciated and feared. Not to mention Chris, his second in command, Chris Rosenberg. Well, he loved him. He loved him like either an older brother or a dad. So did Freddie, who rejoined sometime in 77 or early 78. Freddie's racing career started floundering, and when Roy invited him to become his chauffeur and full-time member of the crew, Freddie said yes. Very eagerly said yes. He was always as eager as a trained dog to please Roy. And eventually, Freddie would be doing some horrible things as an inner member of the crew and someone that close to Roy. But driving was a start. Now, there was some evidence that Freddie was unstable enough to do the horrible things that he would do. He once cut off his neighbor's dog's head and put it on their porch in revenge for a quarrel they had. As an animal lover who loves his pets, I can't believe somebody didn't fucking shoot him in the head for that one. I'm going to talk a lot more about Freddie next episode, because after Roy, he was probably the most interesting out of all of them. He was comic relief in a dark way, a court jester minus the wisdom, or rather a crew jester, one that would become really sadistic under Roy. He had a tendency to encourage that in people. Now, among Roy's legal businesses, he had a car dealership and a pizza restaurant in the village. And that pizza restaurant is today, appropriately enough, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde themed gothic horror restaurant. I go there and eat every so often. The food's good, and I like the atmosphere. I like horror stuff. And I recommend it if you like that kind of thing, if you ever show up in town. Now, Roy, of course, made a lot more from his illicit pursuits than he did his legal ones. And he was like an octopus gorging itself with his tentacles in every cookie jar. If it was illegal and you can think of it, Roy was probably doing it. I'm going to list all his different businesses and some of the things about them this episode. But the one I want to get to first was his biggest and most lucrative business by far, and that was his auto theft ring. Now, I said in episode 2, when I was citing Murder Machine, that he was selling primarily in Kuwait. That was true, but his most important, or at least one of his important destinations before 79 was also Iran. That's not mentioned in Murder Machine for some reason. I'm getting it from Vito's testimony. You can see above the newspaper accounts. So you're probably familiar with, or at least you've heard of, the Iranian Revolution. It happened in 1979. Well, prior to 79, Roy was selling a lot of stolen cars to Iran during a period in which it was led by a benevolent dictator, at least benevolent by the standards of what would follow, a man called the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was on friendly terms with America, and that made it easy for Roy to ship his luxury stolen cars to Iran. It was easy to export them to criminal contacts in Iran's country, who would then buy them at $5,000 a car, which was very cheap for a luxury car like that. And then they would raise the price and sell them at a price that was still a bargain for what they would have otherwise been. And over there, the regulation was minimal, oversight was minimal. They didn't even need to change the VIN numbers. Then came the Iranian Revolution. That's when anti-American activists overthrew the Shah and replaced him with a theocratic dictatorship led by 79-year-old Shiite cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Mustafavi Khomeini, and he created a rogue state. When this happened, well, there goes business for Roy DeMeo. These people were so anti-American, they didn't even want his cheap stolen Cadillacs. When that happened, Roy was very distraught, but he quickly recovered by shipping it all to Kuwait now. Once they stole the car, a luxury car, they would drive the car down to a dock in New Jersey. And from there, they would ship the car overseas, at which point they would sell it for $5,000. And that's $5,000 in which they themselves invested very little money, just the cost of the tools necessary to steal the car. By the way, those unflattering drawings up there are of Vito. They make him look like a cross between Sloth from the Goonies and a bullfrog. Now, one of Roy's coke buyers that he dealt coke to in the Gemini Lounge was a guy named John Quinn. And if you described Quinn to me, or even introduced me to him back then and told me he was a crook, and then asked me to guess which type, well, I would have said coke dealer. I think maybe it's this thick 70s mustache and fancy clothing he had, and the 1970s Jaguars that he was always driving in would have made me think that. Something about that mustache, I always think coke dealer or 70s porn. I've seen too many movies. I realize that's silly, but it's just the stereotype I have in my head. But no, John Quinn wasn't a coke dealer. If he had been a coke dealer, well, more than likely that coke would have found its way up his hungry nostrils, because Quinn was a coke addict, or a coke head, as I like to call them. But that didn't really matter because he could more than afford his habit. When it came to stealing cars, John Quinn made even more money than Roy and made his operation look amateur. I don't know if he had more money than Roy altogether, but at least when it came to auto theft, he made more. And he did it with only 2 other car thieves working for him, that and a dirty cop. I think that dirty cop was Blue, B-L-E-U. You'll hear more about him in the future. But he's the same cop that I talked about when I talked about Pete Lafroscia having a dirty cop on his payroll. Now, John Quinn had several advantages that Roy did not. He had some very sophisticated thieving equipment. He had a large stack of good VIN numbers that he got from breaking into an office building. He would even sell a list of them for $1,500 to Roy and other car thieves. They were called the Quinn Papers. So this would make it even harder to catch a car thief once they stamped the VIN number on there. And his thieving equipment made it far more similar to an actual VIN number than Chris's. Chris's looked like somebody had taken a very amateur stamp and put it on there, and cops could often tell. Now, the fellow you see above is just an actor. I have a photo of John Quinn that I'm going to show you later, but it would give too much away to use it just now. And whenever I use actors to represent the characters I'm talking about, I always try to find actors that resemble the real people. Otherwise, I won't use an actor to represent somebody. I hate documentaries that use people that look nothing like the real people. In fact, that terrible Iceman movie, when they had Ray Liotta playing DeMeo, I would have never used that guy if I was directing that movie. I would have quit before I used him. Not because I don't like Ray Liotta. I think he's a great actor. But because he looks nothing like Roy. I might have used James Gandolfini if he was alive still, because he looks a little bit like him. But I try to get as close to possible when using actors. So John Quinn was a master car thief, and he had two master car thieves working for him who were, if anything, even better than him. Pete Lafroscia, who was only working part-time with Roy at this point, and was working more for John Quinn, and William Kampf, who was a freelancer, but he was working mostly for John Quinn. And William Kampf was completely loyal to John Quinn. Pete Lafroscia was kind of divided. Pete was starting to question some of his boss Quinn's judgments, particularly when it came to his mistress. Although Quinn was married and had 6 kids, he started having an affair with this young, pretty Jewish girl named Sherry Golden. Sherry was a waitress who ironically worked at a restaurant called The Butcher Shop. At 19, she was your typical cheerful and naive young woman, still living with her parents, didn't have much world experience, and she was totally smitten by Quinn. Wasn't bad looking, bought her nice things, was charming, drove the fanciest cars, was confident and cocky. True, he was probably going to end up prison with a felony or dead, but she had some hybristophilia tendencies, seeing Quinn as your ultimate bad boy, a criminal leading a group of criminals. I can only imagine what her parents thought of the situation. They had to be so pissed. John Quinn started to really become infatuated with her, started bringing her around his stolen car operations, and even inviting her to do some of the work, such as type up VIN numbers at her house for him. When Pete Lafroscia heard about this, he was uneasy because this is an outsider. She has no business knowing about this. He went and told Roy. When Roy heard, he was really upset and angry about the situation. He confronted John Quinn and said, "You're nuts! Get rid of her! She's a liability." John Quinn tried to assure Roy that, no, she's not a liability. She's an asset. I don't know why fucking her is an asset to the operation, but whatever. All she was doing was typing up VIN numbers and trivial things like that. And again, she had no reason to be loyal to anybody but John Quinn. You know, if she gets pinched and she's offered a deal, both for her and maybe to help her lover Quinn, yes, of course she's going to turn on Roy. Well, it wasn't legal trouble that hit Sherry. Police raided one of Quinn's chop shops around the same time they learned he was selling stolen bonds. And although Quinn had priorly earned a reputation as a stand-up guy before serving time for hijacking, he didn't feel like going back to prison now, and he was looking at a long federal sentence. So Quinn was brought before a federal grand jury, and he was intimidated into making a decision. Fuck it, he was going to inform on everybody and try to weasel out of getting punished. Now, it was not only cowardly, but this was a really dumb mistake. Not only did he have his own crooked cop who might find out and worry about his own ass, Roy had at least 2 crooked cops himself. And maybe Quinn didn't know about them, but why the hell would he think a guy that powerful didn't have any crooked cops in his pocket, if he himself did. And it didn't take long for Roy to find out that Quinn had flipped.
Roy learned of Quinn's betrayal within weeks, and within a month, he counterattacked, and the results were tragic. But in between these incidents, in June of 1977, another incident occurred, although the details are scarce because everybody who had witnessed it refused to talk about it. A young man, who was only 23, Jerome Hofaker, got into a fight with Dennis Testa. Remember that the Testas were like a brood, and most of them should have never been born. Only one of them turned out to be a cop, and he may or may not have been all right, assuming he was a good cop. But all the rest of them probably should have never been born. Their parents were useless in raising those kids with good values. But apparently, Dennis couldn't handle Hofaker on his own, because later, Joey and Anthony showed up while Jerome was at his girlfriend's house. And either he made the mistake of coming outside, or he was already outside on the lawn, and he was ambushed. But rather than jump him, which they could have just beat him up and jumped him, the Gemini twins, feeling the power of Roy being part of Roy's crew, and it was probably Joey who was the more bloodthirsty of the two, pulled out a gun and shot him, execution style, on the spot. They now felt like they could do whatever they want, and so far nobody was proving otherwise. Now, Jerome's girlfriend's brother witnessed the incident. I'm assuming that they threatened him, made it clear that they would kill him too, and possibly his family. And the DeMeo crew, unlike most mobsters, weren't above going after the family if they couldn't get the person that they targeted. That's in the FBI files. That made them particularly vicious. This kid, he was mildly retarded, and he was terrified into keeping his mouth shut. Now, some of the cops and Capici thought it was part of the don't snitch culture that was around there, and that's possible, but I'm sure he was also terrified as well, especially because he was probably a little bit more childlike due to his low intellect. So it's now well into June of 1977. Roy hears about Quinn's betrayal. He's well aware of it.
And Roy, of course, was enraged, and he decided it was time for Quinn to go. Pete, well, he didn't have a problem with Quinn going either. He does not like snitches. Actually, at Pete's cell phone number, we talked for 3 hours, and I found him very interesting. And I don't think he's in any way a psychopath or anything like that. He came from a mafia family, and that's the way he was raised, with these mafia values. It was like talking to somebody from another world. But that's just my surface impression. I don't know him. He doesn't know me. We've only spoken for 3 hours, and I know some new information that wasn't in any of the books from him. And from Doug, who's his friend. They're constantly talking about those days. Joseph Bennett was another car thief who worked for Quinn. He was also his cousin. Once he learned Quinn was going down, he knew he was going to be next. So he secretly flipped and became an FBI informant. Then one day Bennett got a phone call. The gist of their conversation went something like this. Hello? Hey, hi. It's Pete. Come down here to the Gemini. See Roy. Joseph was terrified of Roy. He had heard Roy was doing terrible things at the Gemini Lounge, that he liked to chop up bodies there like they were lab experiments. He was probably trembling just to go see Roy over there at that meat factory, but he promptly complied. Now, the details are scarce about the time and location at the Gemini Lounge, but it was probably in the back apartment or in the bar room when the Gemini Lounge was closed. When Bennett saw Roy, they began to talk.
Johnny went before a grand jury, and we know it. He was told to get rid of Sherry. I told him personally, and he didn't do it. I'll give you $10,000 to lure your cousin. We'll put the bullets in his head. You don't got to worry about that. I'll give you another $10,000 if you bring Sherry. We're going to get rid of both of them. You don't have time to make a decision. It's a rush deal here,
Roy said. Bennett wasn't sure if this was a setup or not, but whatever it was, he basically said, I don't know, maybe. He wasn't going to say no to Roy, but he didn't want to turn on his cousin either. Instead, Bennett left it at maybe and went about business as usual, which is still betraying your cousin. I mean, they're only going to kill the guy. According to Pete Lafroscia, whom I believe on this matter, the crew fully supported clipping Quinn. He had, after all, betrayed them. But they weren't happy that Roy also wanted them to kill Sherry. Murdering females, well, that's not kosher in the mob culture. It's actually taboo. And she wasn't even a target of the investigation yet, nor did she show any signs of snitching. It seems like some of the crew suddenly felt like clipping Sherry would be more like murder. But they would do what Roy told them to do, and then they'd rationalize it away as the ends justify the means or collateral damage. One of the dangers of tribalism, if the leadership isn't acting with good ethical restraint, it's very easy for members of that tribe to rationalize away behavior that they otherwise would know is unethical. Now, there's some discrepancy between Murder Machine and the New York Times over the next two events, and that's in terms of the time and numbers of days in between the events. Murder Machine puts Shape Up Night on Friday and says 3 days later, Sherry vanished on July 20th, 1977, but the New York Times says Sherry vanished on a Wednesday, which would make it 5 days later. In any event, Shape Up Night happened on one such day, probably Friday, and then 5 days later the next event would happen. Now, to continue. Shape-up nights. Fancy Cadillacs, Porsches, and Lincolns rumble and park around the Gemini Lounge. Pretty much everybody's there. Quinn's there. He comes to check out a Porsche to give to Sherry. Bennett's there. So's Pete.
Are you going to pass up the $20,000 Roy's offering?
Now, $20,000 back then is about $90,000 today, according to the adjustment inflation calculator. And if you're a homicidal criminal, I guess that might seem like good money. But if you get caught, you're going to prison for life just for helping set them up. Because that is felony murder. You don't have to pull the trigger. No, I don't like it. And that's pretty much where Bennett stood. Like an ostrich, he stuck his head into the ground, and he neither helped the DeMeo crew, but he certainly didn't cross them either. I guess this guy either was a total coward or he just didn't care that much about his cousin. Roy found out right away that Quinn was going to testify before a grand jury and snitch on everybody else to reduce his sentence for a $2.5 million security fraud scam he was being prosecuted for in Nassau County, Long Island. He himself lived in Farmingdale, Long Island, not New York City. By the way, if you're curious how much $2.5 million was in 1977, well, it's $11,285,000 in today's money. This guy was no small-time crook. Now, there were at least 3 mob cops connected to the Roy DeMeo crew who could have snitched on the snitch, Quinn. There was Peter Calabro, the infamous cop that would talk to Roy on the side of the street next to the Gemini Lounge, and he worked the auto theft division with John Doherty, a childhood friend of Roy's who had been Calabro's partner, and he was also on the payroll for Roy. His brother worked at the Gemini Lounge as bartender. There was also Detective Blue, who was pals with Lafroscia and helped Quinn, and probably would have been terrified if he learned Quinn had flipped. So those 3 turncoats, it's any wonder this guy didn't get clipped by the DeMeo crew the moment he snitched. Either way, it had been about 5 days after Pete's failed attempt to persuade Bennett to set his cousin up. That's when a distraught Sherry stormed out of her room.
What's wrong, honey?
Her grandmother said. He's going away, Sherry said furiously, her voice full of bitterness.
Yeah, that tends to happen when your boyfriend commits fraud and steals millions of dollars in luxury cars. I think was going to happen. And what was she angry about? I mean, she's angry the government's not letting her boyfriend steal cars from people. Quinn was still looking to buy Sherry a stolen Porsche from the DeMeo crew, so I guess she felt like the government was being inconsiderate of her screwed up romance with a married man. Nevertheless, none of that made what followed less tragic or terrible. Sherry turned and stormed out of her home. Quinn was waiting outside behind the wheel of a flashy silver Lincoln. It was around 8, and there'd been a message from Pete.
You know the number. It's important, Pete said on the message.
Quinn presumed that meant that they wanted to buy more Quinn papers. So Quinn and Sherry drove to the Gemini Lounge. Now, while Sherry waited outside, the windows down, night air, Quinn strode in through the side door, the side of the Gemini Lounge. There's a clubhouse there, there's windows, and there's an apartment in back. What I imagine was very quickly, as soon as Quinn walked into the darkness, a figure walked up behind him and fired a 9mm or some other type of handgun into the back of his head. Although it was equipped with a silencer, and Capici and Mustaine Murder Machine presumes that that would have prevented Sherry from hearing. I think silencers still sound pretty loud, but most people don't know how to identify a gunshot. Sometimes it just doesn't sound like a gunshot. All it does, really, the silencer, muffles it a little bit, but it makes it hard to tell where it came from. While her boyfriend lay dead inside, Sherry was a sitting duck. The twins came outside and strode up to her car, one approaching each window. Now, this was their most common tactic. One of them would distract you as a misdirection, while the other suddenly drew a gun and fired. And as they approached Sherry and leaned in on both sides of the window, looking at her flirtatiously, Joey with that wide grin, Anthony smiling on the other side, they were trying to fake being charming, like they usually were with women, but apparently Sherry wasn't finding it convincing in those last few seconds she was alive. She had looked terrified. The twins had murder on their mind, and it was probably as visible as a pair of headlights, manifesting as cold intensity in their eyes. Quinn was a fool for coming there, and he was an even bigger fool for bringing her. And when she turned to Joey, who was on her side, Anthony pulled his handgun and fired, and the bullet flew through the back of her head. Sherry was probably dead instantly, but Anthony fired 2 more shots as her head swung back around from the force of the trajectory from the first bullet. It was a risky move killing her right there outside. I've been out to look at the Gemini Lounge many times, and there are homes everywhere. Nevertheless, people didn't hear, or if they did, they didn't look or say anything if they did. And that was the end of it. The 2 corpses were taken in different directions with different cars, to be disposed of as a warning. Quinn was found the same night, been shot in the head with a handgun. Probably never even saw it coming. Chris, Pete, and Roy were in the building at the time, and my suspicion is Roy did it, because he oftentimes was the guy who wanted to do the shooting with the handgun. Nobody was more comfortable killing than Roy. The crew had taken 1 car and driven off with Quinn's corpse to Staten Island. They dumped it at the side of the road. The message was obvious: don't fuck with us. Sherry was simply a liability once she had arrived with Quinn, and they felt that it was going to be impossible to explain why her boyfriend hadn't come back outside. Sherry's halter top was shoved below her breast to midsection to make it seem like some sexual pervert had done it. In between Quinn and Sherry's murders and the discovery of her body, life would go on. Anthony Center would get married to a young 19-year-old girl, about her age, and on the same night she was discovered, Roy DeMeo would arrogantly slap a waiter and start a brawl at a catering hall. If you think death is the worst thing that can happen to you,
then you're fortunate to not be acquainted with some of the worst forms of suffering. Seeing the corpse of someone you deeply love violently disfigured into something so macabre it no longer even resembles them anymore is among the legion of unimaginable horrors this world has to offer. The image will follow you until you sleep, into your dreams, and that hellish vision of them will be there with you when you awake. It'll be a scar on your mind that'll never really go away. Sherry's parents and grandmother must have been filled with trepidation when she didn't return. That trepidation must have dissolved into horror and anguish when John Quinn was found that same night. How likely would she be alive now? 3 days later, her rank corpse was discovered bundled into a Lincoln, her decaying breast exposed, her skull shattered into fragments and her brains spilling out. The victim of mindless butchery by Goodfellas, whose identities were nothing more than empty stereotypes.